The skies above Beijing were gray and heavy as Air Force One descended toward the Chinese capital, but the real pressure surrounding President Donald Trump's arrival had nothing to do with the weather. It came from the growing realization that the world was entering one of the most fragile geopolitical moments in years. Across financial markets, military command centers, intelligence agencies, and diplomatic circles, millions of people were watching this summit with nervous anticipation. Because when Trump stepped onto Chinese soil to meet President Xi Jinping, it was not simply another state visit between two powerful nations. It was a meeting carrying the weight of global stability itself. Years of rising hostility between Washington and Beijing had pushed the relationship between the world's two largest economies to dangerous levels. Trade wars had disrupted global supply chains. Sanctions battles damaged industries across multiple continents. Tensions over Taiwan intensified military risks in the Pacific. Artificial intelligence competition turned technology into a battlefield. Semiconductor restrictions triggered economic retaliation. And beneath every public statement from both governments, distrust continued growing stronger year after year. But now, suddenly, something unexpected was happening. China was signaling what analysts described as a fragile thaw, a cautious attempt to stabilize relations with the United States before the rivalry spiraled into something far more dangerous. And Trump's arrival in Beijing became the symbol of that possibility. Reuters.com, https://www.reuters.com/world/China/Trump-arrives-11-summit-2026-05-13/question mark UTM_source=sign ChatGPT.com. As Air Force One touched down, security around the summit reached extraordinary levels. Streets near government compounds were heavily guarded. Diplomatic convoys moved through Beijing under intense protection. Chinese officials carefully managed every public image surrounding Trump's visit, understanding the summit would shape international perceptions far beyond China itself. The symbolism mattered enormously. For years, relations between both powers had deteriorated through tariffs, accusations, sanctions, and military tensions. Now, for the first time in years, Trump and Xi were meeting face-to-face at a moment when global instability was becoming impossible to ignore. The Iran crisis added even more urgency to the summit. Rising tensions in the Middle East, threats surrounding the Strait of Hormuz, and growing fears of economic disruption placed enormous pressure on both Washington and Beijing. Oil prices remained unstable. Inflation fears spread globally. Businesses worried about another major economic shock. And because China and the United States remained deeply connected to the global economy, neither side could fully isolate itself from the consequences of escalating instability. Analysts believed this shared vulnerability pushed both leaders toward cautious diplomacy despite their deep strategic rivalry. TheGuardian.com, https://www.theguardian.com/world/2026/may/13/Trump-China-summit-global-stakes-analysis?mark UTM_source=sign ChatGPT.com. Trump entered Beijing projecting confidence publicly, but behind the scenes the pressure on his administration was intense. Rising fuel costs and economic uncertainty were creating political risks back home. American companies continued complaining about supply chain disruptions and trade instability linked to tensions with China. Financial markets feared the possibility of simultaneous crises involving both the Middle East and U.S.-China relations at the same time. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping faced his own challenges. China's economic growth had slowed significantly. Youth unemployment concerns increased domestically. Export pressures intensified under Western tariffs and restrictions. And Beijing understood prolonged confrontation with Washington carried serious risks for Chinese stability as well. This mutual pressure created the opening for what many called a fragile thaw. But beneath the diplomatic language, distrust still dominated the relationship completely. Washington continued accusing Beijing of unfair trade practices, cyber espionage, military aggression near Taiwan, and supporting adversaries like Iran and Russia strategically. China accused America of trying to contain its rise globally through sanctions, military alliances, and technology restrictions. Every issue connected to another. Trade linked to security. Technology linked to military power. Diplomacy linked to global influence. That meant even small disagreements carried enormous geopolitical consequences. As Trump's motorcade moved through Beijing, the world searched desperately for signs that tensions might finally ease. Markets reacted cautiously to optimistic headlines. Investors hoped improved communication between the two powers could stabilize global trade and reduce fears of future confrontation. Business L. Leaders worldwide wanted reassurance that the world's largest economies would not continue escalating toward economic fragmentation or military rivalry. But analysts warned repeatedly that symbolism alone would not solve the deeper conflict shaping US-China relations. Because the rivalry between Washington and Beijing was no longer simply about tariffs or trade deficits anymore. It had become a struggle over the future balance of global power itself. Inside China, state media carefully portrayed the summit as proof of Beijing's growing international influence and diplomatic importance. Chinese commentators emphasized Xi Jinping's role as a stabilizing global leader capable of managing dangerous international crises responsibly. In Washington, Trump's supporters framed the trip as an opportunity to secure stronger trade terms and strategic advantages for America. Both sides wanted to appear strong. Both sides wanted leverage. And both sides understood the summit's outcome would send powerful signals to allies and rivals around the world simultaneously. Yet despite the carefully staged diplomacy, a deeper fear remained impossible to ignore. What if this thaw was only temporary? What if the smiles, speeches, and meetings could not overcome years of growing geopolitical hostility? Taiwan tensions still remained unresolved. Military competition in the Pacific continued expanding. Artificial intelligence and semiconductor battles were becoming more aggressive. Economic sanctions still shaped global trade networks. And underneath every diplomatic gesture stood the same harsh reality: neither Washington nor Beijing fully trusted the other's long-term intentions. As night fell over Beijing and the first private meetings between Trump and Xi began behind closed doors, the world waited nervously. Markets paused. Diplomats watched carefully. Military commanders monitored developments closely. Because everyone understood the same thing. The decisions made during this summit could influence not only the future of US-China relations, but the direction of global stability itself. And in a world already shaken by war fears, economic uncertainty, and growing geopolitical division, the stakes surrounding Trump's arrival in Beijing had never felt higher. Behind the polished smiles, ceremonial handshakes, and carefully controlled media appearances in Beijing, a far more intense battle was unfolding in private rooms hidden from the world's cameras. President Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping were no longer simply participating in a diplomatic summit. They were negotiating under the pressure of a global system growing more unstable by the day. Every discussion inside those closed rooms carried enormous consequences for trade, military tensions, technology wars, energy security, and the future balance of power between the world's two largest superpowers. Publicly, both leaders projected confidence and calm. Privately, neither side fully trusted the other, and both knew the stakes had rarely been higher. The atmosphere inside the negotiations was tense from the very beginning. American and Chinese delegations arrived carrying years of accumulated hostility. Trade wars had damaged industries across both economies. Semiconductor restrictions had escalated technological rivalry. Military confrontations near Taiwan increased fears of future conflict in the Pacific. Sanctions battles expanded across finance and technology sectors. And now, the Iran crisis had added another dangerous layer to the already fragile relationship. Trump entered Beijing determined to secure visible progress. Rising economic uncertainty and growing instability in global markets were placing pressure on Washington. American businesses demanded supply chain stability. Financial markets feared prolonged confrontation with China could trigger deeper global economic slowdown. At the same time, Trump also wanted Beijing's cooperation in calming tensions surrounding Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. Reuters.com. But Xi Jinping had his own agenda. China's leadership understood the United States needed results urgently, and Beijing intended to use that leverage carefully. Xi wanted relief from American tariffs and sanctions that had slowed Chinese economic growth significantly. He wanted reduced pressure on Chinese technology companies and fewer restrictions surrounding semiconductor access. And perhaps most importantly, She wanted recognition that China had become a global power equal to the United States rather than a country Washington could simply pressure indefinitely. TheGuardian.com. This created a diplomatic battlefield where every issue became connected to another. Trade negotiations linked directly to technology restrictions. Iran discussions connected to broader strategic rivalry. Taiwan tensions hovered over every conversation like an invisible shadow neither side could ignore. According to diplomatic insiders, one of the earliest points of friction involved tariffs and trade access. Trump pushed aggressively for greater market access for American companies operating inside China while criticizing what Washington described as unfair Chinese trade practices. She responded by demanding the rollback of tariffs imposed during years of economic confrontation. Chinese officials argued that stable economic cooperation could not exist while America continued treating China as a strategic threat economically and technologically at the same time. Neither side wanted to appear weak. Yet both sides also understood that prolonged economic hostility carried growing risks for their own economies. Behind closed doors, discussions about artificial intelligence and semiconductor competition became especially sensitive. The United States viewed advanced chip technology as critical to national security and military superiority. China viewed American restrictions on semiconductors as deliberate attempts to slow Chinese technological rise globally. BBC.com. Trump's advisors reportedly warned Xi that America would continue protecting key technologies aggressively. Chinese negotiators responded by accusing Washington of weaponizing trade and innovation for geopolitical containment. The deeper the discussions went, the clearer it became that the rivalry between the two powers was no longer simply economic. It was about who would dominate the technologies shaping the future global order itself. Taiwan remained the most dangerous topic of all. Although both governments avoided public confrontation during the summit, military tensions surrounding the island shaped nearly every strategic calculation behind the scenes. Beijing demanded respect for what it called China's core sovereignty interests, warning against increased American military cooperation with Taiwan. Trump's team emphasized America's commitments to regional stability and Pacific allies while avoiding promises that could weaken U.S. strategic positioning. CNN.com. The issue exposed the deepest problem facing the summit. Even if economic tensions eased temporarily, the broader geopolitical competition between Washington and Beijing continued intensifying underneath the diplomacy. Meanwhile, the Iran crisis forced both leaders to confront shared vulnerabilities. China depended heavily on Middle Eastern energy supplies, while America feared economic damage from prolonged instability surrounding Hormuz. Trump pushed Xi to pressure Tehran toward de-escalation using China's economic influence over Iran. Xi publicly supported stability but resisted appearing subordinate to American strategic goals. Chinese officials reportedly warned that cooperation regarding Iran could not happen while Washington continued escalating pressure against Beijing elsewhere simultaneously. Reuters.com. This revealed the summit's deeper reality. Every negotiation became transactional. Every concession demanded something in return. Trust barely existed at all. Yet despite the tension, both sides also understood the consequences of failure. Financial markets were watching closely. Businesses worldwide wanted signs of stability. Allies and rivals studied every signal coming from Beijing. Neither Trump nor Xi wanted responsibility for triggering deeper global instability through diplomatic collapse. That mutual pressure created moments of cautious progress during the talks. Reports suggested both governments discussed limited tariff adjustments, expanded communication channels, and temporary frameworks for reducing economic tensions. WSJ.com. But analysts warned repeatedly that the agreements remained fragile because the underlying strategic rivalry had not disappeared. In many ways, the summit resembled two powerful rivals trying to manage confrontation rather than truly resolve it. As negotiations continued late into the night inside Beijing's guarded compounds, the world waited anxiously for signs of breakthrough or breakdown. Outside the meeting rooms, cameras captured diplomatic smiles and optimistic statements. But inside those closed doors, Trump and Xi understood something far more serious. The future relationship between the United States and China would likely shape global politics, economics, technology, and security for decades to come. And while the summit might temporarily calm tensions, neither side could fully escape the growing reality that the world was entering a new era defined by strategic competition between two superpowers increasingly struggling to coexist peacefully. Long before President Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping sat across from each other inside Beijing's guarded meeting halls, the global economy had already begun reacting to the summit as if the future of financial stability itself depended on what happened next. Markets moved nervously with every new headline. Investors watched every diplomatic signal closely. Business leaders across Europe, Asia, and America paused major decisions while waiting for clues about whether the world's two largest economies were moving toward cooperation or deeper confrontation. Because after years of escalating trade wars, sanctions, technology battles, and geopolitical rivalry, the Trump-Xi summit had become far more than a political meeting. It had become a test of whether the global economic system could survive rising tensions between Washington and Beijing without falling into deeper instability. The reason for that fear was simple. The United States and China together sit at the center of the modern global economy. Nearly every major industry, trade route, financial market, and supply chain is connected in some way to the relationship between these two superpowers. When tensions rise between Washington and Beijing, the effects spread everywhere. Factories slow production. Shipping costs increase. Technology industries face uncertainty. Investors become cautious. And global growth begins weakening almost immediately. Over the past several years, trade disputes between the two countries had already disrupted international markets repeatedly. Tariffs imposed by both sides increased costs for businesses and consumers worldwide. Supply chains built over decades suddenly became vulnerable to political confrontation. Companies struggled to predict regulations, sanctions, and future restrictions. Reuters.com. And by the time Trump arrived in Beijing, many economists warned the world economy could not endure another prolonged escalation without serious consequences. One of the biggest concerns centered around manufacturing and supply chains. China remained one of the world's most important manufacturing centers, while American markets and technology companies depended heavily on Chinese production networks. When trade tensions intensified, businesses faced higher costs, shipping delays, and growing uncertainty about future operations. Major corporations quietly began moving supply chains to alternative countries in recent years, but replacing China entirely proved far more difficult than many expected. Factories, logistics systems, ports, and labor networks built over decades could not simply disappear overnight. That meant prolonged hostility between Washington and Beijing threatened to create continuing instability across industries ranging from electronics to automobiles to consumer goods. Semiconductor competition added another dangerous layer to the crisis. The battle over advanced computer chips became one of the most critical economic and strategic issues between both countries. The United States imposed restrictions designed to limit China's access to advanced semiconductor technology, arguing national security concerns required stronger controls. China viewed those restrictions as deliberate attempts to slow Chinese technological development and weaken Beijing's long-term economic rise. BBC.com. This semiconductor war terrified global markets because modern economies depend heavily on advanced chips for nearly everything: smartphones, artificial intelligence, defense systems, banking infrastructure, transportation networks, and industrial production. If tensions escalated further, experts warned entire sectors of the world economy could face major disruption. Rare earth minerals became another critical issue shaping the summit. China controls large portions of the global supply chain for rare earth elements essential to modern technology manufacturing. These materials are vital for batteries, military equipment, renewable energy systems, and advanced electronics. Washington feared China could eventually use its dominance over rare earth exports as economic leverage during future confrontations. Beijing, meanwhile, viewed American efforts to reduce dependence on Chinese supply chains as direct threats to Chinese economic influence globally. TheGuardian.com. The deeper this rivalry expanded, the more businesses feared the world economy could split into competing blocs shaped by geopolitical alliances rather than open global trade. And then came the Iran crisis, which pushed the economic pressure surrounding the summit even higher. Rising tensions around the Strait of Hormuz caused oil prices to surge repeatedly, increasing inflation fears across multiple continents. Shipping costs climbed. Energy markets became unstable. Consumers faced higher fuel prices while businesses worried about slowing economic growth. China and the United States both understood prolonged instability in the Middle East could severely damage global recovery efforts already weakened by years of inflation and trade disruption. That reality forced Trump and Xi into a strange position where strategic rivals suddenly shared urgent economic interests. Neither side wanted global recession. Neither side wanted financial panic. And both knew continued confrontation carried enormous risks. Investors worldwide desperately searched for signs of stability coming from Beijing. Stock markets reacted positively even to small hints of diplomatic progress between Trump and Xi. Financial analysts explained why markets hate uncertainty more than almost anything else. Businesses can adapt to difficult conditions if rules remain predictable. But escalating confrontation between the world's largest economies created constant uncertainty about trade, technology access, sanctions, tariffs, and future global growth. That uncertainty slowed investment, weakened confidence, and increased fears of recession. WSJ.com. The deeper the tensions became, the more dangerous the economic consequences looked. Yet despite the urgency, neither Trump nor Xi could simply abandon their strategic goals completely. Trump wanted stronger trade protections, technological advantages, and geopolitical leverage for the United States. She wanted recognition of China's rising global influence along with reduced American economic pressure. Both leaders faced domestic political pressures preventing major concessions from appearing too weak publicly. That made this summit incredibly fragile. One diplomatic breakthrough could calm global markets almost overnight. But one major disagreement could trigger another wave of economic instability across the world. As negotiations continued behind closed doors in Beijing, governments, corporations, and investors everywhere understood the same thing. The future direction of the global economy now depended heavily on whether the world's two most powerful nations could manage their rivalry without pushing the international system toward deeper division and crisis. And in a world already struggling with inflation, war fears, slowing growth, and geopolitical uncertainty, the stakes surrounding this summit had become almost impossible to overstate. Even as President Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping continued their carefully controlled diplomacy inside Beijing, another crisis loomed silently in the background, one far more dangerous than tariffs, trade disputes, or economic rivalry. Taiwan. Behind every handshake, every public smile, and every diplomatic statement during the summit stood the same terrifying reality: the future of Taiwan remained the single most explosive issue between the United States and China. And according to military analysts around the world, it was also the issue most likely to trigger a direct confrontation between the world's two strongest powers. While both leaders publicly focused on stability and cooperation, military planners in Washington, Beijing, Tokyo, and across the Pacific understood something deeply unsettling. Even if trade tensions eased temporarily, the deeper strategic conflict surrounding Taiwan had not disappeared at all. In fact, many feared it was becoming more dangerous with every passing year. For China, Taiwan is not simply a geopolitical issue. Beijing views the island as part of China's sovereign territory and considers reunification a historic national objective that cannot be abandoned. Chinese President Xi Jinping repeatedly described Taiwan as a core interest connected directly to national pride, territorial integrity, and the future legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party itself. Reuters.com. From Beijing's perspective, foreign support for Taiwan represents outside interference designed to weaken China strategically. That belief shapes nearly every aspect of Chinese military and diplomatic planning in the Pacific. The United States sees the situation very differently. Washington officially supports the One China policy while also maintaining strong unofficial ties with Taiwan, including military support and security cooperation. American officials argue stability in the Taiwan Strait is critical to regional peace and global economic security, but Beijing increasingly believes the United States is slowly strengthening Taiwan militarily and politically in ways designed to contain China's rise globally. That perception intensified dramatically during recent years as American naval operations expanded in the Pacific and military cooperation with regional allies grew stronger. CNN.com. This growing mistrust created one of the most dangerous military environments in the world. Chinese military drills around Taiwan increased sharply in recent years. Warships, fighter jets, missile systems, and naval exercises became more aggressive and frequent near the island. Beijing described these operations as warnings against separatist forces and foreign interference. Meanwhile, the United States increased naval patrols through the Taiwan Strait while strengthening military coordination with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and other Pacific allies. Both sides insisted they wanted stability. Yet both sides also continued preparing militarily for the possibility of future confrontation. BBC.com. What terrified military analysts most was the risk of accidental escalation. In crowded airspace and contested waters near Taiwan, even one collision, miscalculation, or misunderstanding could suddenly create an international crisis spiraling out of control. Fighter jets from both powers increasingly operated near each other. Naval forces maneuvered through sensitive maritime zones. Surveillance missions intensified constantly. And because distrust remained so high, experts warned any unexpected incident could trigger dangerous reactions before diplomacy had time to intervene. During the Trump-Xi summit, Taiwan became one of the most sensitive issues discussed behind closed doors. Chinese officials reportedly demanded stronger American assurances limiting military support for Taiwan. Trump's advisors refused major concessions, emphasizing commitments to regional security and American allies. TheGuardian.com. This revealed the deeper problem shaping the entire relationship between Washington and Beijing. Economic cooperation might still be possible. Diplomatic communication might continue. But strategic mistrust surrounding military power and regional dominance remained unresolved completely. America's alliances in the Pacific complicated the situation even further. Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia all watched the summit closely because Taiwan's future could directly affect regional security across Asia. Many American allies feared China's military rise was changing the balance of power in the Pacific dramatically. At the same time, Beijing viewed expanding U.S. military alliances near China as evidence Washington intended to contain Chinese influence indefinitely. This created a cycle where each side interpreted the other's defensive actions as offensive threats. The more China expanded military capabilities, the more America strengthened regional alliances. The more America increased military presence, the more China accelerated preparations around Taiwan. And slowly, the possibility of future confrontation continued growing beneath the surface of diplomacy. Technology competition made this situation even more dangerous. Taiwan sits at the center of the global semiconductor industry, producing many of the advanced chips powering modern economies, artificial intelligence systems, military technologies, and communication networks worldwide. That meant any conflict involving Taiwan would not remain regional economically. It could disrupt the global technology sector almost instantly. Governments and corporations understood this clearly. A crisis surrounding Taiwan could trigger supply chain collapse, financial panic, and technological disruption across the world economy. WSJ.com. This is one reason why the Trump-Xi summit carried such enormous global significance. Diplomacy between both leaders was not only about trade or temporary stability. It was about preventing a future where military rivalry between the United States and China could become uncontrollable. Yet despite all the discussions about cooperation, neither side appeared willing to compromise fundamentally on Taiwan itself. Beijing insisted reunification remained non-negotiable eventually. Washington refused to abandon regional commitments or strategic influence in the Pacific. And that meant the deeper rivalry continued moving forward quietly beneath every diplomatic breakthrough. As night fell over Beijing and military ships continued operating across Pacific waters thousands of miles away, one brutal truth remained impossible to ignore. Even if Trump and Xi managed to stabilize economic tensions temporarily, the fear of future conflict surrounding Taiwan still remained. Because at the center of the U.S.-China relationship was no longer simply competition over trade or influence. It was a growing struggle over military power, regional dominance, and the future shape of global leadership itself. And unless the deeper mistrust changed someday, the world's two strongest powers might only be postponing a confrontation both sides increasingly feared could eventually come anyway.